Hey everybody, and welcome back to our study group going through Peter Watson's History of Philosophy Without Any Gaps group. Today with me I have Rogerio and Graham. Welcome back, guys. And we'll be discussing episodes 12 and 13 of the European Philosophy series, covering a bit of a recap over the pre-Socratics we've talked about so far, and then also talking about Hippocrates and some of the early Greek medicine. Welcome, guys. How are you doing?
Hi. We have quite a bit to cover here in terms of a summary or a recap. One of the episodes we're covering here is an interview or a conversation between Peter Adamson and Michael Scofield, a scholar from a colleague from of Peter Adamson's, so really looking forward to share some lessons we acquired from these two professors.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you for joining us again, Graham, in spite of it being really early where you are.
Oh, not a problem. I'm thoroughly enjoying this with you guys. It's a great journey. I was going to say I'm also, looking forward to bringing those together with the pre-Socratics, and then heading into some medicine with Hippocrates, and that kind of brings it down to the human level that we've been talking about. These, as opposed to the high and mighty abstract thoughts we've been dealing with. So, tagging on back.
So I can just describe really quickly what I brought that involves both visual aids and readings. So I checked a few sources like Isaac Asimov's The Greeks, A Great Adventure. He talks a bit about the why the Ionians became the Ionians. So that's a possibility to share as well. As for the visual aids, the slides, just to show the geographical context where we are mentioning. It's really interesting, this idea of the first philosophers being not the Greeks from the mainland, but they are the basically ultramarine colonizer Greeks that are either to the far east in the western seaboard of Turkey, or in Italy and Sicily. So all from Greek colonies, which to me as a Portuguese is a phenomenon that is familiar to me. I've also lived in the outskirts of the Portuguese world at the beginning of my life, and then moved back to the mainland Portugal, basically. And similarly to the Greeks, it seems that the Portuguese that are more inventive, have more entrepreneur spirit, and are less held back by beliefs, are the ones that either immigrate to other countries or were part of the colonies. And so this kind of phenomenon seems to have happened as well with the ancient Greeks. Here we have the cities. Feel free to comment, Nerdalem and Graham Pons.
Yeah, just maybe I want to highlight that I think Hippocrates is from Kos, so over to the southern side of the modern-day Turkey's coast. Like it's a little island just off the coast.
Yeah, it's just southward from Samos, and west from Miletus and Rhodes. It's also represented with the head of Hercules wearing the Nemean lion. It's really small, but that's what the coins from Kos showed, which I found really interesting. Let me just transition really quickly to the section where we will start to give a visual aid and the context. So what we propose today to talk about is a summary of the early Greek thinkers, or earliest Greek thinkers that Peter Adamson talks about in his episodes, and also we will transition to Hippocrates, considered the father of Western medicine.
Yeah, so in the interview with Michael Schofield, he asks if there's something the pre-Socratics have in common that kind of bind them together as a group of thinkers that came before Socrates. And so they're quite interesting general observations as little groups or little cliques of thinkers, like a couple of thinkers that had similarities here and a couple of thinkers that had similarities elsewhere. So the first couple of thinkers, they talk about are the Milesians, which I think are most of the Ionians we've discussed so far. I think the other Ionian would be other Ionians would be Xenophanes, Xenophanes, and Heraclitus. But yeah, pointing out that they had a fairly naturalistic worldview, but not necessarily a religious, just a different kind of religion than the pantheon found in Homer. And especially with Thales, it's a little bit more speculative about the others, but they seemed to be quite practical people, like technologically oriented people using their understanding of nature and mathematics to get business done and to solve technological problems. And the Milesians seems to mostly have written in prose, so a narrative kind of prose, which is a little different from the Magna Graecians or the people from Italy, who more typically wrote in verse. Heraclitus also wrote in verse, and I think Xenophanes also more poetic approach. And yeah, so of the, if you could go back to the previous lines with the Ionians and the Thracians and the Grecians, can we just maybe give a quick list of? Oh, you have a specific list of the names, but so the Ionians are the Milesians, which would be Thales, Anaxagoras, Anaximenes, and maybe Xenophanes. The Thracians
is Democritus from Abdera, basically. There are not many more from this northern part of the Greek world.
All right, and the Magna Graecians are like there's a long list of them, right? So there's Pythagoras and Parmenides and Zeno and Melissus and Anaxagoras and Empedocles.
Yeah, although to be fair, we must mention the nuance that Melissus is, according to all sources that at least I've found, they say that he is from Samos, and I've never found a source saying that he traveled to Elea, which is strange. At the same time, he follows the Eleatic tradition, but it's supposedly he lived in Samos and even was an important historical figure there in terms of winning a naval battle against the Athenians. And as for Pythagoras, he was born in Samos as well. And supposedly after a tyrant gaining power in Samos, he emigrated to Croton, that is in the front of the boot of Italy.
You know, I picked up on the similar sorts of ideas that these were, you know, the common thread amongst all of them was that whole practical people finding naturalistic explanations, and they all tended to be public figures involved with, you know, government or different aspects of their, and all of that kind of combines to me where they were basically trying to take these ideas and put them into words to basically explain them to other people. And the first people with, you know, with the writing and the alphabet, they're trying to communicate again amongst each other, learn people. And with, you know, you can tell with the switch from the poetry, where that was pretty much, you know, performed for people to explain to the illiterate. And you can see like the transition to whereas literacy expanded, you had more prose, more explanation, and it was less reliant upon vocal performance necessarily. So that was some of what I was picking up then there. What do you guys think, Taggin?
To complement, it is, of course, a reality that literacy wasn't widespread, clearly. Also, the writing media wasn't cheap by any means. And so it is kind of looks like a no-brainer for people to be spreading ideas by declaiming verse, which would be a double whammy of making things more easy for the audience to remember because of the verse structure and probably rhymes. And it wouldn't need any medium, probably only the poet, the poetic declaimer, like Xenophanes, for instance, who supposedly performed at banquets. He just needed to travel and take his material with him, either in his memory, in his head, or he would read from a scroll. It's not absolutely clear whether he would read or recite from memory. And so these constraints probably were pressuring these thinkers to go more towards poetry.
Yeah, another thing that stands out as a general feature of them that's maybe not so much different than the thinkers we will talk about later in this series, but it's quite different from how we think and do things nowadays. Different from how we think about and do things nowadays. Most of these thinkers seem to have fairly eclectic interests. At least it seemed that they were in the business of trying to explain everything. So they had these cosmologies where they tried to explain all of reality. And there was a bit of a mixture between science and ethics and medicine. And we'll get into how medicine mixes in with the cosmological worldviews a bit later today when we talk about Hippocrates. But it was notable to me that it was less specialized, it seemed, the very early philosophers.
If I may also go ahead. Graham.
I was going to say that it seems to me that that's an example of basically you're starting with the blank sheet of paper, and you need to make some statements, make some choices, and as you go on, those choices get refined, and you get finer and finer divisions going. So it seems that just seems a natural progression to me, that you're going to start with the most general abstract, and it gets more refined and parsed out and divided as they go on. So just noticing that pattern there. Tagging.
There's also contexts from where these people came from. When the mainland Greece 3,000 years ago, more or less, was invaded by the Dorians, people were shifting southwards until they reached the southernmost part of Greece, and it was full of overrun, basically. And so the remaining option was to flee through the sea, and the people spread throughout Ionia and the islands in the Aegean Sea. And so these people that are the Ionians, they are descendants from these brave adventurers who didn't want to stay in mainland Greece that was tumultuous at these times. And so 500 years later, the descendants of these peoples are our very first Western philosophers. But they also didn't start precisely from scratch. Thales is, by accounts, he traveled to Babylonia and to Egypt, where he learned astronomy and geometry, respectively. And it's really interesting how Thales was distancing himself from using supernatural explanations for physical phenomena. And he chose his arche, which is the prime substance, as water. And so he even used his knowledge of the physical phenomena natural phenomena to amass wealth by the story of the knowing that the next olive yield would be higher than usual due to the weather patterns, and he bought of the olive presses and made a lot of money. He showed that in practical terms, if people distance themselves reasonably from supernatural explanations, they can have a better grasp on physical phenomena, which can enhance their lives in terms of their necessities and their needs. And besides this, supposedly Thales was the first to study electricity, at least in the Western world, to study what is called electron, which is amber in ancient Greek, and magnetis lithos, which are magnetic rocks. And so even going so far as saying that because these substances move other things, that they might have souls.
Yeah, do you maybe want to run through the next of the summary of the thinkers?
Yeah. And so he didn't work, he didn't stop there. He had potentially disciples or students like Anaximander and Anaximenes, which probably they were either peers or learned from one another. Anaximander described his arche as being a boundless void or apeiron. In terms of astronomy, he was the first to say that the sun was huge and far away, which was kind of spot on for the time. But the Earth, he described the Earth as a short, a kind of a cylinder, a very short cylinder in height that is suspended freely in space. And he also had some notion or concept that life changes over long periods of time, even though he didn't flesh out a kind of a Darwinian theory, but it had some elements as animals gradually morphing from sea living animals to up to humans gradually. And then for Anaximenes, he described his arche as air or pneuma, and he believed that the air was divine, and so he distanced himself a bit from Anaximander in talking about something that is much more physically provable. There was an instrument in ancient Greece called the water thief, that was a kind of a metal ball with holes on it, and it was held on the other extreme. It had a handle, a long handle. It looked like kind of a mace, but people would hold it the upside down, and they would immerse the ball with holes in water and would press with their finger on the handle that also had a hole, and so the water wouldn't fall out. And in Anaximenes' time, he probably realized that what was pushing on the water to prevent it from falling out was air. And so they kind of experimentally demonstrated that air exists with the water thief. Anaximenes also talked about how air, since he said it is the principal substance, could rarefy into denser materials like fire, or it could condense into denser materials like water or earth. So that's the rundown for these guys. Feel free.
Can we maybe do a rundown of the others and maybe a slightly quicker?
Sure. So the Magna-Grecians, you mean? Let me go to these guys. Oh, there's also the other Ionians. So we talked about Xenophanes of Colophon, Pythagoras of Samos, and Heraclitus of Ephesus. So not from Miletus, but from these other towns. And Xenophanes would also invoke an arche, a principal substance. He, according to Michael Scofield, said that the principal substance are clouds, but maybe he was joking. which we will encounter this joke in a more serious turn when we talk a bit more about Socrates in the future. Just to keep that in mind. He was also knowledgeable about natural philosophy and physical cosmic explanations. Also aware of fossil evidence. Michael Scofield and Peter Adamson referenced this. And as we said, he wrote in verses and declaimed poetry at banquets, at least at banquets. And in terms, he had very strong positions in terms of theology and the ethics that can be drawn from theology. He opposed meat sacrifices, saying that since the gods are supposedly perfect beings, they don't need anything from us. Also criticized the violent stories written down by Homer and Hesiod about the gods fighting amongst themselves and with titans or giants. Probably didn't give good examples for children and youth in Xenophanes' conception. And he also argued that God's idols were made in the image of who created them and not the other way around. And so he kind of wanted to reinvent theology to serve ethics way better than was being executed in the past by Homer and Hesiod. Do you guys want to comment anything or?
Yeah, but Xenophanes, the thing I liked about him was his skepticism. So he reckoned people can't really know things about the gods, but also he was quite convinced that there's a lot of things said about gods that aren't true, that don't make any sense. So he had his own theological or religious beliefs that he held, saying, well, I don't know if they're true, this is what I think. And I like that kind of intellectual humility. As far as I know, from the pre-Socratics, only person noted for that.
Yeah. He probably had some inspirations because Milesians traveled a lot and they encountered many different people from many different islands and seaboards and coasts. It was notorious in Hesiod's time, for instance, that there were many different gods being worshipped by many different peoples from different settlements, even just speaking for the Greeks. So Hesiod was also trying to make sense of it all, putting these gods together in a nice family tree, even though convoluted. And by traveling a lot, people widened their perspectives. And these Ionians, they for sure traveled as means of their professions. Probably some were related to trade, and others were, as for Xenophanes, traveling to do his shows in poetry. And probably they encountered people worshipping gods, different gods in different ways, and even outside of the Greek world for the cases of the Egyptians, Ethiopians, Babylonians, etc. And after some travels, these individuals would probably figure out the arbitrarity of rituals that were being carried out in different parts of the world by different peoples, realizing that they can't all be right. All these gods, probably some of them are made up, or if not all of them are made up, and especially made up in the image of those who are worshiping them and creating the respective idols. And so this context might kind of explain Xenophanes. So this kind of widening perspectives of multiculturalism, perhaps, in my view, might explain Xenophanes.
That makes a bit of sense to me. Graham, what do you think about that?
No, that makes a lot of sense to me. Xenophanes, he was definitely trying to, he definitely well set in the, he was building off of the Milesian, the Milesian sort of start, where he was bringing together, his own archy, his own take on it. And I was going to just start on with Pythagoras here, where I find him sort of one of those transition inflection point people, where he while Thales was the father of philosophy, Pythagoras was the first philosopher, and he used number for his arche. And he kind of basically, instead of just kind of writing, he kind of took it to the next level with the whole cult sort of concept, where he was basically indoctrinating and teaching people into his ideas, as opposed to the others seem to more like communicating them, just not quite, more to the masses. And it was basically secrets, initiations. He seemed to be bringing some of the stuff he learned in Egypt and Babylon back here from the initiation and cult standpoint. And that's part of what makes Pythagoras so a fascinating transition character here. Tagging to you guys.
Yeah, the mythology and the legend around Pythagoras is actually quite interesting. Obviously, most of it's very unlikely to be true. The things that stand out for me is his emphasis on both mathematics and music, and I guess ethics too. That seems like a fairly potent combination. So I also quite like the mathematical focus of the of Thales and those guys too. But yeah, the recognizing that there are certain harmonious ratios that produce pleasant sounds. Interesting precursor to the idea that illness is born from a kind of disharmonious disproportion. So this notion of proportion and harmonious ratios and like balance is a rich idea that I quite like, even though it's probably not Pythagoras who invented it. And yeah, I like the notion of soul almost as a kind of harmony, and I think I talked about it the last time, that the image of souls moving between bodies by kind of harmonic resonance, like musical instruments can resonate with each other with the frequencies of other musical instruments. They're pretty cool ideas. Yeah, I think
this notion,
that even though the concepts may be a bit primitive, I do think people can empathize with other people's emotions. So I do think emotions can be contagion. We talked about this last time when we talked the last time we talked about Pythagoras too. Is that things like yawns and laughs and anger can be contagious. It can spread between groups. So there's a sense in which like anger is a bit of a sub-personality. I'm a slightly different person when I'm angry than when I'm in a good mood, like in a playful mood. And you could almost think of, if I'm getting anger empathically from someone else, that there's there's an angry ghost that's sort of possessing me for a little bit. And people do still today talk about being possessed by a raged or possessed by an obsessive love interest. In that, like, phenomenologically, it feels as if something from the outside takes over. That's probably not how it actually works. I think that modern cognitive sciences say that's not quite how it works. Like there's some, it's more complicated than that's what modern science basically says. But yeah, it's really interesting things to think about.
I believe the ancient Greeks even used the word daemon to describe when different aspects of our character or personalities are kind of taking the reins. And we will also encounter this concept when we discuss Socrates, as you'll see. There's also this idea that they discovered the irrational numbers and they were distraught, frustrated, perplexed by them, maybe even alarmed, because they thought that numbers were such perfect entities that could be simplified and described succinctly. And irrational numbers clearly thwarted them in this endeavor. So I thought this was also a really interesting aspect of Pythagoras. And so, yeah, and going back to the myth about him, so many amusing stories that are probably made up after the facts, maybe even centuries later, to kind of pit him against the prophet of Christianity, Jesus Christ. So people inventing maybe that he had a golden thigh, that he healed miraculously, that he could even converse with geological features and animals. And that's amusing story of him, since he said he believed in the immortality of the soul, that people were beating a dog, and he was shouting at them to stop because he heard his friend's voice in the dog's cries. And so, yeah, a really interesting character that is way more than just a philosopher, at least from our point of view, from the 21st century, with all the dressings that other thinkers probably piled up on his life story.
It's also easy to see how some of those stories may have just been exaggerated over time based on something a little bit more mundane. So people do imitate each other, and I've often noticed in groups where people are fairly new to each other that over time they'll learn phrases and they'll speak it with a prosody, so an intonation and a rhythm that's similar to the people they've recently met. So that I've often sort of experienced myself hearing the voice of one relatively new friend in another, from the body of another relatively new friend. Whereas when those two were still fairly new and didn't know each other, they would never sound like each other. But since they spend time around each other when I'm not around, say friend A has a thing she likes to say and friend B never says that thing. 6 months later, friend B is also saying that same kind of thing in the same kind of tone of voice with the same kind of rhythm. So you can kind of hear friend A in friend B. And pets also imitate their owners. Like, I think owners tend to pick pets with features that remind them a little bit of themselves. So often people will have pets that look a little bit like them. And pets can also imitate to a lesser degree than humans can. But you can, I think if a dog has heard their master cry many times, I think it's quite plausible that the dog will cry more like their master than they would some other person that they've never heard cry before, even if it's not the same. So I think a person would be able to pick up similarities like that. So yeah, magically a friend's reincarnated as a dog's not so plausible, but a dog crying in a way that reminds one of one's friend, totally plausible.
There's also this pattern that I've noticed with these thinkers. So they started pretty much with a cosmology, especially a cosmology that distances itself from the ancient representation of gods, which, to be fair and to be frank, was not a representation that gave good ethical and moral examples. And after these thinkers were figuring out conceptions of how the world works, which arguably are stuff of metaphysics. So they are metaphysical constructs that describe how the world works. Then they naturally kind of ask themselves, okay, so the world works like this. It is water, or it is air, or it is infinite or boundless, or it is fire, as the case of Heraclitus. And it seems to me that they naturally transition from cosmology, metaphysics of cosmology, to ethics and morality. Pythagoras and his followers were notoriously known for the 71 golden verses of the Pythagoreans, which were linked very closely to a morning routine where the followers of Pythagoras, both during his lifetime and after this lifetime, they would recite these 71 verses, of which I have a really small excerpt here, which goes, "Before you fall asleep, make sure you reflect on your actions of the day. Ask yourself, what did I do wrong? What did I do right? What did I miss doing that I should have done? If you realize you made a mistake, be harsh in your self-criticism. If you did something good, be happy about it. And the structure of these 71 verses, I checked it out yesterday. It starts by saying you must worship the gods that have been prescribed by law, by human law. They don't go so far as to say that, but basically be lawful, and you must operate within the constraints of your culture. And then in the middle of the verses, many prescriptions for self-development, self-improvement, self-knowledge, like this excerpt. And then it ends by saying, if you follow this rigorously every single day, like an unconditional ritual, you will ascend to something of a state of godhood, and you won't fear death. Death will be something that the fear of death will be something that you have surpassed. And this is, in a sense, very aesthetically pleasing. And probably it drove people to follow Pythagoras. Just going back to Heraclitus. Feel free to comment. Otherwise, we can move to Heraclitus.
Yeah, I'm happy to move on to Heraclitus. Something Heraclitus had in common with Xenophanes is writing in a provocative way to try to encourage people to think in new ways about things. So saying sometimes things that it's not entirely clear what is meant by it, or whether what Heraclitus actually thinks. Same with Xenophanes, but that, like, when one considers them, it may lead one, depending on how one reflects on the statements, to come to some fairly deep insights about how language works, or some metaphysical insights about how we structure the way we make sense of the world. And also it's difficult to not think of, we'll get to them, the Eleatics as quite provocative thinkers, and maybe even enjoying provoking the crowds, saying things that to get people to think about things in new ways, even if they're not necessarily correct. And
or they are paradoxical.
Paradoxical, yeah.
Or at least at the surface level, without any further explanation, they seem paradoxical and inconsistent, which probably is part of the reason why they were thought-provoking.
Definitely. One of the aspects of it that I've noticed is they tend to be much like Zen koans, like the sound of one hand clapping. And to me, that's sort of it's built into kind of the playing on the words and how words don't capture reality properly. And it's just, he's emphasizing and making jokes on that one. And again, good philosophy, but it can be maddening and aggravating trying to argue about it.
Yeah.
So tagging back.
Just to build upon that, there is also this principle that is contemporary to us, which is called Cunningham's law. And it states, if you publish something that is wrong on the internet, chances are you will get way more engagement because of the fact that it is wrong, and people are they can't help themselves but correct you. And so probably it is similar to the approach that Heraclitus here had. And yes, there are clearly parallels with Zen koans. They were kind of discovering the same source for making everyday citizens start to think.
Yeah, maybe an observation about the Ionians as a group is they seem to be interested in finding out the one base ingredient out of which all of reality is created, which sets them apart from the later atomists, and also some of the thinking that goes into the medicine we'll be describing a bit later, where there's not just one basic ingredient but a couple of basic ingredients, they sort of get mixed together in different proportions.
No, definitely. You hit on the idea that Heraclitus, he chose fire. And that the idea of almost it's not really what we would think of as fire. I would say it's more of the idea of almost like a motion, sort of action is the basis of everything. And you can see each of the Ionians and Milesians are basically drawing from that. What is that arche? What is that one substance? And they're all sort of coming up with like different words to it. And I think that a lot of that got put an end to with Parmenides, where with his monism, it's pretty much that kind of bound them all together and gave a new focus in saying it's the monad that's behind everything, and regardless of what its relationship to all of that, aperion or fire, water, clouds, air, it's the monad, and we're just going to run with the monad from here. Hagen.
So let's move to Magna Graecia to talk a bit about the Eleatics. Okay, so Parmenides, Zeno, and Melissus.
Yeah, it's kind of hard not to get frustrated with these guys. They make fairly outrageous sounding claims. So Parmenides famously argued that change is impossible, and Zeno took that further and said, like, no, all movement is impossible. And I forgot what exactly Melissus added to that party.
I can show a quote that might jog our memory.
I think he was with Parmenides, except so basically the same as Parmenides, but Parmenides said the monad is a round thing, and he just said, like, that's doesn't make any sense because it'd have to be something outside of the roundness, so it's just this infinite thing that has no outside.
Yeah. According to Peter Adamson, he drew a distinction between the followers of Parmenides. So Zeno was a kind of a more destructive follower. Oh, our colleague dropped out. Zeno was more of a more destructive follower of Parmenides because he kind of destroyed the everyday notions that people had, kind of pulling the rug from under their feet very drastically with his mind-numbingly perplexing paradoxes. While Melissus of Samos seemed to build upon what Parmenides already said, and as you said, he expanded the notion of Parmenides saying that the cosmos is like a sphere, at the end of this quote, to say that it is infinite and unbounded. So he kind of went for the apeiron. He kind of drew perhaps from the apeiron of an Anaximander to enhance his monism here. Maybe make it even more defensible or more impervious to attacks from the rival schools.
Yeah, now this is where one of the observations I had before with Parmenides and the Eleatics is the idea that they basically reaction to Heraclitus, where the philosophers play leapfrog with each other, dealing with the questions and answers the other one came up with. And it's the idea of Heraclitus had being and becoming together in all of it one, like the river, where the river is both the being and the becoming combined. Parmenides basically did away with the arguing about becoming, because with words we can't talk about becoming, we can only talk about being. And that's where when he talks becoming, that's why he has things being unchanging. And I see it's like Zeno basically takes a lot of Heraclitus's arguments, and he kind of parses those down using Parmenides' being in order to say how being would deal with all of Heraclitus's ideas. And Melissus tends to integrate them all together and create it more as to bring it together into a school, into more of a schema and a system. Again, it seems very similar to a lot of how the whole Socrates, Plato, then Aristotle sort of sequence goes. Just my observations there, Taggin.
Yeah, this is a really interesting bounty that we can gain from studying these individuals in a sequence and regularly. We start to figure out potential influences from one another. Some are really evident, as Melissus integrating the idea of Apeiron and building upon Parmenides. And this really helps us, besides having the historical context to help us realize how they had pressures to come up with their ideas or influences from outside even their nations. We can start to kind of get a feel or grok the genealogy of thought, to figure out where the thought is flowing, and realizing that people are here influencing each other, and they are combining ideas from the past and innovating thusly.
Yeah, it would be a little difficult to understand why the hell Zeno would come up with these paradoxes if one didn't know about Parmenides. And it would be difficult to understand where Parmenides is coming from if one didn't know about people like Heraclitus and Xenophanes. So yeah, it's interesting to note or even someone like Pythagoras, because Parmenides also had like the trappings of a bit of a cult leader. He starts his poems with that, in which he gives his arguments with a supposed divine revelation from a goddess that shows him the way of truth versus the way of opinion. And yeah, that seems quite similar to the kind of cult leader, religious figure status of someone like Pythagoras. And it gives one a little bit of idea of there's a cultural context around a lot of these thinkers, without which it can be quite difficult to interpret them. And that's true of people generally. It can be difficult to understand what people are on about, why they're asking the questions they're asking, why they go about answering questions in a certain way. It can be really difficult to understand if you don't have cultural context. And so meeting people online who are in different contexts, it can be really easy to completely misunderstand people's intentions or the story that's playing inside people's heads when they're doing something, if you don't understand their cultural context. And typically we don't. Like, how many people really have the cultural context for all cultures across the world? So we're sitting on 3 different continents having this conversation, and it kind of works, but I think there's still a lot of room for misunderstanding each other because we don't fully know each other's cultural context.
On the flip side of that, those differences allow us to have, basically 3-sided vision here, where we don't have we each have our own cultural blind spots, but those are going to be revealed by the other 2 people. And I think that's a great benefit for areas like this too. It's sort of a give and take. You're going to have some communication issues, but you're going to have insights you could never have without them. So, Taggin.
Yeah, this is dialogue and dialectic complementing just thought, just mere thought by an individual. It was also notorious that these different schools were really rivals, in the sense that they tried to argue against the arguments of each other, to debunk their arguments, especially notorious between the atomists and the monists. The monists with their idea that everything can be conceived as one, everything that exists, that is, while the atomists would say that time is actually real and change is real, and these units of being are dispersed throughout space and time, and they are called atoms, and they are indivisible. Just to show here the 2 guys that we were talking about, the atomist Leucippus, who we don't know where he is from. We don't know if he's either from Ionia or from the Italian side. And so We just assume that these were educated guesses. While Democritus, we know that he's from Thrace, more precisely the town of Abdera.
Yeah. I guess that from the kinds of arguments Lysippus makes, it would make more sense for me for him to be Ionian than Magna Graecian. The Magna Graecians seem to have a bit of a flair for occult leader status and like really wild metaphysical speculation, and the more down to earth guys seem to be the Ionians, the more practical, technologically focused people. So if I had to cast my vote, I'd guess more Ionian than Magna Graecian, but I don't really know either.
Yeah, likewise, probably me as well, and especially due to my science and technology background, and also my leaning toward the Ionian thinkers matches as well the representation or description Carl Sagan made of the Ionians as really kickstarting what we can consider science, at least a rudimentary form of science, and an interest in technology and technological invention. For instance, Anaximander is attributed to him the invention of a form of a sun clock, and also cartography.
Yeah, can you guys remember where Empedocles is from? Is he from Italy?
Yeah, Empedocles is from Italy. Just checking here the.
So like Pythagoras isn't from Italy, but he moved there because he felt more at home as a cult leader among the guys who like their cult leaders.
Hey, farm where the land's fertile.
So Empedocles is from Acragas, which is in Sicily.
Yeah, they're like the philosophers, all mystical cult leaders, whereas the Ionians, like their philosophers, all engineers and politicians.
Yeah, Melissus was a politician and a naval commander, and Thales even intervened in a conference to unite the cities or city-states of Ionia against the Lydians who wanted to overrun and take control of the Ionian settlements. So going back to the map here, all these cities, Colophon, Ephesus, Miletus, Rhodes, they were in the 5th century BC bordering the Lydian kingdom. And so even, this is really interesting, even the eclipse predicted by Thales occurred in a specific date that astronomers nowadays can pinpoint. And it is supposedly there was a battle between Lydians and Medians, the kind of tribe that was integrated into Persia later on. The eclipse occurred as predicted by Thales on the day of the battle. No one on the battlefield was aware that it would happen. No one had the knowledge or foresight from Thales. They were all dumbfounded, perplexed, and thought it was an incredibly bad omen from the gods. And so in an unprecedented and very strange event in history, the Lydians and Medians stopped fighting. They made peace and never fought again. This is
peace is possible as long as the sun eclipse happens at the right time in the right place.
If you have a big enough mouthpiece to declaim peace, like the gods, and everyone believes the gods really reverently, peace can happen.
I was going to say, that sounds like the unified enemy. It's sort of like, okay, we're both on the same side of this one. And just a quick, just a correction on the Medians. They weren't a tribe that got integrated into Persia. They were their own empire that was huge, and they took out Assyria. But then they got taken out and merged with the Persian Empire later. That's what happened.
Yeah, I got into a bit of a trouble trying to get my terminology straight between family, clan, tribe, I guess fiefdom, kingdom, ethnicity, empire, like all that stuff. I was kind of like in modern days, the word tribe is kind of used interchangeably for a lot of those things. So a tribe could be something like a clan-like structure, or it can be something like a whole political party, like one side of a political divide in a nation can be called a tribe. So it's a little slippery. But yeah, I think the technical definition for a tribe is a group of clans, and a clan is defined by their common lineage to a patriarch or a matriarch. So like an extended family.
Perhaps a bit akin to those who know about the Dune novel of Frank Herbert, the houses. Kind of like Atreides, the Harkonnens, and whatnot.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was going to say they'd almost
that,
be kingdoms in my sense for the houses in Dune, but yeah.
I'm not entirely sure if for a clan the common matriarch or the common patriarch has to still be living. If it was several generations, it could grow into something like a kingdom. I think if it's like say 4 or 5 generations, it probably wouldn't be as big as a kingdom. Talking say between I guess 30 and 100 people for large extended families.
Yeah, I always heard it more or less by size. It's like a tribe, sort of. It tends to top out in that 150 to 250 size range. And when and once you get much beyond that, you're required to have cities and laws and that sort of stuff. So then you start to get kingdoms out of that. That's what I've seen from the anthropology and the sociology of the situation. I don't know if that tracks with you guys, but tagging.
Don't really know either. We're in a bit of a tangent here now to maybe bring it back to the history of philosophy.
I think what we can move towards now is how philosophy intermingled with medicine.
Actually, I'd make one last comment on the atomness real quick. And that's that it seems to me that they were trying to salvage the idea of motion and becoming by denying the monad of Parmenides and basically saying the atom is its own monad in a void. Just wanted to share that concept before we moved on. Tag.
Oh, and maybe we can just reference Anaxagoras and Empedocles, especially because their ideas kind of seem to be building toward Hippocrates as well. So Anaxagoras had this idea of universal mixture. In an example that Peter Adamson mentioned, in cheese there is also both the seeds, or at least the constituents or components of bone and flesh. And so when people eat foodstuffs, these components are then integrated into the body. And he would say that everything is in everything. And there is this idea that that might have to do with the some of the virtues or benefits from foodstuffs. And then Empedocles talked about the 4 elements: fire, water, air, and earth, and saying that if the elements are balanced in the body, this probably is conducive to health, and disease is a state in which there's some imbalance in those elements, and so this kind of foreshadows or perhaps even inspired the Hippocratic tradition and Hippocrates himself.
Yeah, so Empedocles had a reputation as being a healer, and probably was both a thinker and a doctor. and also the source for much of the like really abstract theoretical thinking in ancient Greek medicine. So the source of the idea that the basic, at least in the Greek version of the idea, that the basic ingredients of the world are earth, air, fire, and water, and then the idea that health is when we have those basic elements in the right proportion in our bodies, and people can be healed or get sick if they get out of proportion, and healing can happen when they go back in proportion. But yeah, in discussing the Hippocratic corpus, or the text and the medical practices, Peter Adamson makes the point that there was a practical, empirical side to it that was just a lot of observations and trial and error learning that was sort of documented. That was quite atheoretical, and a lot of the authors sort of warned against being overly theoretical in medicine, because medicine is a lot more complicated than this really simple theory. And people like simple ideas, so I think it was quite popular to reckon oneself quite knowledgeable in medicine if one understood this like really simple proportions theory, whereas medicine and health and well-being can be really complicated, as we know. So yeah. Also, an interesting point about Hippocrates and the Hippocratic corpus, or the group of texts that are ascribed to Hippocrates. It's not at all clear which he wrote himself and which are other authors that he just sort of had his name slapped on the cover because of how famous he was. He was a very famous doctor. And yeah, we still talk about a Hippocratic oath, because like one of the texts attributed to him was called the Oaths. It was for general practitioners, the kind of ethical codes that they swear to live by. And yeah, like there's some fairly accurate everyday advice in some of that stuff. So maybe if the science isn't all up to date and it's been superseded, there's the idea that prevention is better than cure, I think, holds up still today. And the emphasis on the importance of eating a healthy diet and getting good exercise is still something that we consider important today. And also the hesitancy and the reluctance to engage in evasive procedures like surgery is also something we still keep today. And yeah, this quote you have up in the picture, like, first of all, do no harm, seek to help, or at least not to harm. It's also something that's considered quite important today, although I think there's some qualifications to that. Like often, like invasive medical practices do involve quite a bit of harm, and yeah, it can be some harm to give you good value. So sometimes the trade-off is worth it.
There's of course this idea of the net result or net harm. So if you want to do something that is risky, the benefits better be worth it. Otherwise, you will be just doing harm. So of course, this kind of qualifications is necessary. Go ahead, Graham.
Oh, I was going to bring it back and just have a couple comments. It's like Anaxagoras, I saw him as very much a syncretizer, where he was bringing like all the thoughts together, and that's why he's the first one in Athens. He was basically bringing all the different thinkers together and trying to syncretize them and bring the knowledge to the Athenians. I saw Empedocles sort of like the next step after the atomists in a lot of ways, where they were trying to use atoms for how, for basically that to rehabilitate the idea of change. And what Empedocles was exploring was the idea of transition. He was going more into how these various different elements transitioned into each other. It's like in the earlier pre-Socratics, they just sort of said that they did, and he was getting more into the nuts and bolts of it, which then leads to Hippocrates, where he took a lot of Empedocles' ideas on transition and brought it to the human being in a very practical sense, and like how the body worked, and using those ideas to figure out, at least on a first pass, health and how those ideas could be used to benefit, humanity and the body and all that. And the one thing that I don't think Hippocrates would realize was the difference between curing and treating. And because, prevention is the first thing you want to go for. Cure is second, because you'd much rather cure than treat, because at least with cure it's done and over, tagging out.
It's also worthwhile to make a very brief reference to the fact that although this Hippocratic corpus, composed of more or less 60 writings, most of them attributed to Hippocrates, and we are not sure whether he wrote them all or not, or his followers or whatnot were also involved, even after his death. These are the first treatises on medicine in the West, but by no means are the first in history. Before that, we had 4,000 or 5,000 year old treatises in ancient China and ancient India, with the traditions of the treatise, medicine treatise addressed to the Yellow Emperor, and also the Ayurveda and Yoga sutras or Vedas, ancient texts. So these things already existed. They were up for grabs for these curious thinkers of early ancient history to pick up on here in the West. And so it's only natural for us to see this conception of 4 elements or a simplification in some sense to be pervading in these medical treatises attributed to Hippocrates, which is understandable. People want to simplify things as a mnemonic to understand things better, but at the same time they wanted to really emphasize the caution that medical doctors shouldn't just execute these rules like a computer executing code, same size fits all patients. They needed to figure out the specific and particular attributes of the patient, and also to not just treat the body part that is diseased, but to treat the patient holistically. And so these, just to try to give a context for where these ideas might have come from, besides these Ionians and Magna Grecians that clearly inspired the physics of medicine, and also the ethics of medicine, which I find really interesting. Philosophy helped kickstart medicine in the West with at least these 2 gifts of physics and ethics.
Yes, something I quite appreciate about those early texts, and I think this is a feature of Ione, the philosophers in Ionia, is a kind of naturalism that's still reverential and religious, but sort of sees in nature something worthy of veneration and taken very seriously and trying to understand on its own terms. And we're starting with Xenophanes, like moving away from trying to use anthropomorphized gods to understand things purely, but like sort of understand nature as it is. And with the Hippocratic corpus, the texts where, say, something like diseases like epilepsy was in many places considered to be a kind of spiritual disease caused by different kinds of gods. And yeah, so the quote that epilepsy is no more sacred than any other disease, but also no less sacred than any other disease. All diseases are divine and all are human. So yeah, a kind of almost nature worship, seeing the divine in nature and then making a very serious study of that on its own terms, I think is something that is inspiring even to this day. Like nature is quite awe-inspiring and venerable. And yeah, I want to point that out.
The one that I would sit here and point out to is, unless I'm really wrong, there were a lot of Egyptian texts.
He really tagged out this time.
How long have you been sitting on that joke?
Yeah. Of course, it's worthwhile to reference the other nations. ancient Egyptians that Graham was mentioning. Of course, they really had good knowledge of human anatomy and physiology. They weren't shy of performing autopsies and embalming the dead, so they had a fair bit of experience by dissecting human bodies.
Sorry,
Go ahead,
Rogerio.
go ahead, Graham.
Yeah, no. So sorry, my connection's being challenged right now. But yeah, no, I was saying that I know that the Egyptians, like you were saying, with the autopsies and the embalming and all that one, and I know they have a lot of ancient texts, the Egyptian papyri stuff and all that. They had they had a lot of medical texts, and it seems reasonable that Hippocrates would have been bringing a lot of that one, especially given all the philosophers that did travel to Egypt and Babylon back in the day. So tagging out on that.
Yeah, so just when you dropped your connection, Rogerio made a really cool joke about you tagging out becoming more severe.
Yeah, we need to philosophically employ humor as well. Yeah, just to really do a quick breakdown on the comparisons that Peter Adamson drew between philosophy and medicine. So both were planted in Homeric poems, although there was a clear bias toward explaining things in terms of gods. There were these characters mentioned in Homer's Iliad, descendants from the doctor Asclepius, that were kind of battlefield medics. They used herb salves to heal the wounded and resets fractures and whatnot. Also, it's really striking how Homer represents an excellence in a medical treatment on the Olympians' side. So there were these two instances where Ares and Aphrodite were wounded by a mere mortal called Diomedes. And what happened afterwards was really interesting. They boarded their chariots with flying horses and scurried back really quickly, as if these chariots were ambulances, back to Olympus. And they took either the nectar of the gods or ambrosia, I'm not sure. But they had these substances that would heal miraculously. And so I thought it really interesting how they kind of return to the mothership and are healed really quickly in these passages of the Iliad. And so even if of course made up and fictional, they kind of represent an ideal of medical treatment, when medical treatment works really well. And at the same time, it is really interesting how, although our medical science nowadays is nowhere near these kind of miraculously healing substances, we are way closer to that ideal than these ancients were starting their medical treatises and learning how to treat and heal by trial and error, and employing these theories from natural philosophy and also ethics to serve as a foundation for the medical tradition.
No, I would also note that in the Trojan War, Athena played battlefield medic. I forget who that was. It might have even been Diomedes, where basically gave them the nectar and the ambrosia on the battlefield in order to revive them.
Hector.
Oh, it was Hector. Yep.
She was defending Hector and was antagonizing Zeus.
Yep, that's right.
Or really, I think she was with Zeus on both the side of the Trojans, and she was defending Hector, I believe.
Nope, you're right. It's Hector. You prompted my memory. Sorry, I was going off of memory rather than checking. So good job. Thanks.
There's also this clear association between the early medical tradition, Hippocratic tradition, and the Ionic coast and offshore islands. Hippocrates supposedly was from the island of Kos, and although people there would speak in a Dorian dialect, which is more closely related to the Spartans that are more distance from intellectual pursuits. But the Hippocratic treatises were written in the Ionic dialect, which is much more close to these earlier philosophers, Thales, Anaximander, Anaximenes, Heraclitus, Xenophon. And as we've said, distance themselves from religion and try to become more scientific, more rational, even though they are just starting. In some senses from scratch, in other senses from bits and scraps from these other way older nations like Egypt and Babylonia.
Yeah. I stick it to my points about talking about the naturalism versus religion, or one of the things Peter Anderson says, I think he compares the Hippocratic oaths to Xenophanes, where Xenophanes seem to have believed something like rationality is the proper religious attitude, so not at odds with religion, I say, but like rationality is a kind of religion almost. And similarly with this medicine, sort of rational medicine is the proper way to, like the proper religious way to go about things. One of the quotes, I forgot who it was ascribed to, is this idea that prayer is good, but like when someone really needs care, you should also lend a hand and not just pray. And also, prayer is good, but in addition to calling on the gods, one should also lend a hand. One of the Hippocratic authors. So yeah, that's I appreciate that. It's beautiful to me.
Yeah.
There's a joke from my personal life that I really like. It was really late at a party one night, and we were all heading out home, and like one really kind, like inappropriately, excessively kind person offered to help the hostess doing the dishes, and a much less kind other friend at the party said, "No, we'll pray for you while you do the dishes. We're going home now." So yeah, it's kind of reminded me like sometimes prayer can be like this thing to do instead of giving real help. Nice, like really ancient author says, like prayer that's fine, but also like render practical hand.
I was going to say, it reminded me of the phrase, God helps those who help themselves. Tag.
Yeah, even from contemporary medicine, there is this idea that even if not the extreme of prayer, if you have someone that is critically ill and you waste time with tests and examinations that are not essential and time wasting, and you are delaying the life-saving treatment that this person is giving you, you're not following the best recommended evidence from the best studies we have and from the best experts available. So there's this idea of prioritization since the dawn of medicine and still alive today.
Yeah, one aspect of that Hippocrates didn't face is he didn't have to face the advice of lawyers, where you have to run all those tests in order to protect yourself from a lawsuit. And, oh, well, if the patient dies, you had to run the test so you didn't get sued. Tag.
Yeah, I guess it's quite complicated.
I would also like to show an aside that although Peter Adamson mentions that Hippocratic medical tradition distances itself from the divine and from the gods, he told this this example about people having this connection between medical practices and religious practice. When you're sick, you go sleep in or near the temple of Asclepius. If you are favored by the god, you will have a dream during which the god will either heal you or give you instructions on how to be cured. It's not clear whether this tradition is concretely before Hippocrates, and then Hippocrates broke away from this kind of practice, or if this practice continued during and after Hippocrates' time. But I thought it's kind of interesting that certain temples, the temples to Asclepius, would, in a sense, be like analogous to hospitals.
No, they definitely were the hospitals of the Greek world, and to the best of my knowledge, they did keep the whole dream healing aspect of it going pretty much until at least the Roman Empire time. Tagging on that.
We can also approach the one of the most visible theories of balance or imbalance in the human body that really was picked up and taken to its utmost end in the medieval times. So just to skip a few slides, the four humor theory. So not all. This is something that Peter Adamson mentioned. Is not 100% clear cut and consistent across the Hippocratic corpus. Some of the texts were trying to piece together a theory or at least a model of balance and imbalance within the human body. And not all were exactly the four humor theory, but I think the most popular, especially after Hippocrates' time, was this four humor theory, where even not just the impact on disease from this theory, it also kind of explains some behavior, human behavior, and shifts of personality. For instance, if someone is very angry, they would apply the term choleric, while if someone is melancholic, it was related to the black bile. So this is something that would transform into what was picked up as some practices like bloodletting, to reduce the impact of the excess of blood in a sense.
Yeah, and it's interesting to note about bloodletting. For some conditions, quite helpful, actually. So I think there's even some studies showing that men who regularly donate blood typically have on average, a better health than men who don't. So there is something to bleeding that is sometimes good, but there's also, it seems, a wise caution against excessive use of potentially quite dangerous procedures like bleeding and cupping.
By trying to correct an imbalance, you can overshoot the point of balance, and then again do more harm than good. I can also see another instance in which reducing blood volume could help. There are people that have hypertension because the kidneys aren't producing enough urine, and so in that sense, a very high blood pressure could be a little bit reduced by some bloodletting. But again, it should be really moderate to not make the person die from anemia.
Yeah, and doing bloodletting on someone who's suffering from anemia could kill them.
Yeah.
I was going to say some of that you're looking at, it's going to be some placebo effect happening because the people think it's supposed to help them, so it will, even though from a physiological standpoint, it's not. And again, some of that is kind of how homeopathy works at times too. So tagging.
Yeah. Still, it kind of showcases in terms of evidence that the placebo effect is a collection of mental or brain and physiological processes that is probably heterogeneous and complex and composed. It's kind of like the sum or end result of several different processes going on, and it is real. medical evidence shows that it is real, and it can be less in intensity or higher in intensity, depending on the intensity of belief of the person under study.
Yeah.
But it's not the whole deal. We need also the treatments per se to have a direct physiological beneficial effect. Otherwise, if the disease is too severe, even the most extreme form of belief probably won't suffice.
I think there's a story about Niels Bohr where he had a totem above his front door or something, and someone asked him, "But surely you don't believe in that?" And he says, "No, I don't believe in that, but I'm assured it works even if you don't believe in it." So there's,
that makes him a practical man, then, I guess.
yeah. So, but there's a bit to modern medicine where it's almost the definition of medicine that works is medicine that works if you don't believe, like even if you don't believe in it, it still works. Then we say it's real medicine.
In my humble opinion, I would like people to also respect doctors of excellence and treatments that are really they really supported by evidence, and believe from understanding, not from blind belief, which is a really important concept in Buddhism called Sada. And so we could have both worlds potentially. We could have a treatment that's physiologically works, and we even can describe the mechanism by which it works down to the molecules. And if people understand it and are involved in the medical decision, which has been a big trend, at least in North America in the recent years, to involve the patient in the decision and kind of get them on board and explain them, probably medical evidence supports better or shows better outcomes in this situation.
Agree 100%. Informed consent's important, and if the patient knows what's going on and how it works, now you're back to the placebo effect with the understanding, and it's more likely to be effective. That's sort of my take on that whole situation. Tagging.
Yeah, I'm all for evidence-based care. hard to argue against that one, although some people do, surprisingly.
Yeah. But we like to be more like Ionians. We like our physics to make sense, to match how the world works as best as possible. We have done a huge path of learning since Thales, and there's still work to do. I would also like to show a really one of my favorite quotes from attributed to Hippocrates. This is, life is short, but the art is long. Even if someone dedicates themselves to medicine, even if just a specialty like cardiology or neurology, they will never be able to claim that they know everything that goes on in health-wise and in terms of disease, even in just the subsystem of the human body that they study. And so there's this ethically justified humility, humbleness that is really important for people from this art of medicine to assume. Hubris is one of the worst ills to befall people that are dealing with complex systems.
It makes for good stories, the hubristic, narcissistic cult leader philosophers, but I don't think they're the helpful ones. Really help people live better lives.
Well, that's only if you're looking from outside the cult. If you're inside the cult, they think they're the most wonderful thing ever, and what would be life be like without them? Yeah, I'm not a cult person, so tag.
Yeah, me neither. And this comes again back to the distinction between sectarism and eclecticism, these two extremes. And the Ionians would see different cultures, different doctrines, different traditions, and they would they wouldn't embrace one and just ignore the rest. While the Magna Grecians on the other side of the Greek world, they seemed really clearly more sectarian, more secluded, more closed off.
Yeah.
But
Shall we-
it's miraculous. They still contributed. They still contributed, like Pythagoras contributed mathematically, and Empedocles as well.
Yeah, I guess as long as the contributions are real, idiosyncrasies and oddities and eccentricities can be forgiven. Guys, shall we wrap it up?
Yeah.
How about you, Graham? Any last thoughts?
You still with us, Graham?
Yeah, no, I'm back again. No, like I said, Hippocrates, my take on him is he was the first one to bring it down to the human individual level and start integrating philosophy in like the everyday life of the ordinary person. And, you know, again, that's what medicine is all about. So I'll have that be my final thought. Tag.
Thank you. I think I've said the things I've wanted to say. Roger, any final thoughts?
Yeah, well, evidence-based medicine is the way to go. These guys laid the groundwork. People need to broaden their perspectives on different takes on a subject, so that they don't either fall into the trap of being 100% believing in authorities or 100% skeptical of authorities. It's better to strike a balance and realize that even authorities are human beings. They might make mistakes, but they are also the best that we have available, and that they can do these studies and hand over evidence that we don't even need to attach to evidence from the same author or the same group of authors. We can have a constellation of sources of evidence that helps us make up an image that is hopefully an approximation to how reality actually works, to inform us on decisions for lifestyle and well-being, and in the medical arts as well.
Thank you, and thank you for joining me and us together for this study group. I'm really grateful for this and really enjoying it. Looking forward to next weekend. Bye, everybody.